Welcome to the Quotive Corner. I'm going to start today's episode a little differently, with something I saw floating around the internet recently that made me laugh. Nobody seems to know who said it, and honestly, that might be the point. It goes like this. Everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change the toilet paper roll. Heh, yeah, I know. Take a moment. But here's the thing. The reason that landed for me isn't just because it's funny, which it is. It's because the moment I read it, I immediately thought of something Leo Tolstoy wrote more than a century ago. And I'm fairly convinced that whoever crafted that toilet paper line had Tolstoy in the back of their mind, whether they knew it or not. Because Tolstoy said essentially the same thing, just with considerably more gravitas and considerably fewer bathroom fixtures. Here's Tolstoy's quote. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. That's Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest novelists in human history, the man behind War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and a deeply serious thinker on morality, social justice, and the inner life. He was born into Russian nobility in 1828, spent his early life with all the privileges that entailed, and then spent the second half of it in a kind of sustained moral crisis about almost everything he'd been given and everything he'd done with it. He converted to a radical form of Christianity, gave away much of his wealth, championed nonviolent resistance decades before Gandhi, who credited Tolstoy as a direct influence, and wrote extensively about the corruption of institutions, the obligations of the privileged, and the necessity of inner transformation. Which brings us to the delightfully uncomfortable irony that hangs over this particular quote. Because Tolstoy, the man who wrote passionately about the dignity of the peasant class and the moral rot of the aristocracy, also kept serfs working his vast estates in conditions he publicly condemned. He preached self-transformation while reportedly being a difficult, inconsistent, and at times deeply unkind presence in his own household. His wife, Sophia, kept diaries for decades. They are not flattering. The gap between what Tolstoy argued and how Tolstoy lived is one of literary history's more spectacular contradictions. And here's what I find genuinely interesting about that. It doesn't invalidate the quote. If anything, it authenticates it. Because Tolstoy wasn't writing from the mountaintop of personal perfection. He was writing from the middle of the same struggle he was diagnosing. He knew this trap from the inside, which might be exactly why he named it so precisely. So, what is he actually saying? The observation is almost embarrassingly simple once you analyze it. People are far more comfortable identifying what's wrong with the world, with systems, with institutions, with other people, than they are examining what might be wrong with themselves. Outward critique is energizing. It gives you something to push against. It positions you clearly on the right side of whatever line you've drawn. And it costs you very little, internally, because the problem is always over there. Self-examination is a different animal entirely. It's slower. It's less satisfying in the short term. It doesn't get you likes or applause, or the feeling of righteous momentum, and it requires you to look at things you generally prefer not to look at. The contradictions in your own behavior, the ways your habits undermine your stated values, the gap between who you say you are and who you actually show up as on a regular Tuesday. That gap is a toilet paper roll. Small, mundane, easy to leave for someone else, and yet entirely within your own power to address. We've talked before about how James Clear framed the relationship between systems and outcomes, that what you actually do on an ordinary day is the real measure, not what you intend or aspire to. Tolstoy is making the same argument at the level of character. The person who spends enormous energy wanting the world to be different, but invests nothing in examining and improving themselves, is, in a very real sense, all ambition and no infrastructure. The vision is there, the internal scaffolding isn't. And before anyone hears this as an argument against caring about the world, it isn't. Tolstoy wasn't saying the world doesn't need changing. He clearly believed it did, passionately and at considerable personal cost. The point is sequencing and honesty. The person who has done serious work on themselves, who has developed self-awareness, examined their blind spots, and built the discipline to act according to their values rather than just their impulses, is actually more equipped to contribute meaningfully to change beyond themselves, not less. Gandhi understood this. He called it being the change you wish to see, a formulation so close to Tolstoy's it practically rhymes with it. Dick Winters understood it too. The thing that made him an extraordinary leader wasn't just tactical brilliance. It was the depth of self-discipline and self-knowledge he'd built. His people trusted him because he clearly held himself to the same standard he held them. The inner work wasn't separate from the outward leadership. It was the foundation of it. The honest counterpoint, and there is one, is that self-improvement can also become a convenient avoidance of engagement with the world. The person who is perpetually working on themselves, always in some inner process, never quite ready to show up and do something, that's its own trap. At some point, the inner work has to produce outer action, or it's just a sophisticated form of staying comfortable. So, Tolstoy's challenge isn't an either-or. It's a question of where you're starting. Not ignore the world. Not ignore yourself. But before you point the finger outward, make sure you're not skipping the harder conversation inward. Which brings us back to the toilet paper roll. Nobody is going to write a manifesto about it. Nobody is going to organize around it. But whoever keeps walking past the empty cardboard tube and leaving it for someone else to deal with has, in miniature, demonstrated exactly the dynamic Tolstoy was talking about. The awareness that something needs changing, combined with the quiet decision that it's someone else's job to do it. It's a small thing. That's the point. Because the world is mostly made of small things, and the person who can't be bothered to address the small ones in their own orbit probably isn't going to be as useful on the large ones as they imagine. Tolstoy knew this. He also largely failed to live it, which makes him a more honest teacher than a saint would be. He wasn't handing you a principle from a life of perfect execution. He was handing you something he struggled with himself, recognized clearly, and cared enough to name anyway. Maybe that's the most human version of wisdom there is. Thanks for being here at the Quotive Corner. If this one made you think of a small, easy thing in your own life that you've been quietly leaving for someone else, you know what to do. Change the toilet paper roll. And as always, remember, wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next episode.